It was a quiet evening in the hills of Nyamira. Birds chirped softly as the sun dipped behind the trees. Wanjiku, a kind schoolteacher, came home to a surprise. Her husband, Obasi, had set up a small dinner table with candles and flowers. "Happy anniversary," he smiled, pulling out a chair for her. Wanjiku was touched. They hadn't celebrated like this in years. She sat down, not knowing what danger waited in the air. Obasi poured 2 glasses of juice and raised his glass to toast. Behind his smile was a dark secret. He was drowning in debt, greedy and desperate. He had made a terrible plan. He wanted to poison Wanjiku tonight, then claim her family land as his own. She didn't suspect a thing. Her heart was still full of love and trust. As they toasted, Obasi kept watching her closely, waiting. Wanjiku took a sip, smiling back, but something in his eyes felt strange. The night, meant to celebrate love, held a silent threat. The air was still, but something felt wrong, and though Wanjiku didn't know the full truth yet, her instincts had already started to whisper something wasn't right about this toast. Wanjiku sat down slowly, her eyes scanning the table. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. A small candle flickered between them, casting shadows on Obasi's face. He smiled at her, wide and strange, his eyes shining too brightly. It wasn't the usual warm look he gave her on good days. This smile felt stretched, forced, like it didn't belong. He kept staring, barely blinking. Wanjiku gave a small, nervous smile back and looked down at her plate. She felt her stomach twist, though she couldn't say why. Obasi poured the juice again, laughing a little too loudly as he raised his glass. "To us," he said, his voice cheerful but tight. Wanjiku lifted her glass slowly. As she moved it toward her lips, the candlelight caught something on the rim, tiny white dust, almost like flour, clinging to the glass. Her hand froze mid-air. She looked again. Yes, it was there. A thin line of powder around the edge, just on her glass, not on his. She looked up, and he was still watching her, still smiling that too wide smile. Her heart began to pound. Suddenly, the strange look in his eyes made sense. He wasn't celebrating. He was watching, waiting. But for what? She lowered the glass, pretending to cough. "Something in my throat," she said quickly, buying time. Obasi chuckled and took a sip from his own drink, still watching her like a hawk. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just nodded and pushed the food closer to her. Wanjiku's mind was racing. What was that powder? Why only on her glass? Why was he so focused on her every move? And why tonight, after so many cold months of silence between them, why was he suddenly kind, smiling, romantic? Her instincts screamed. Something was wrong. Obasi reached for the knife to cut some meat, talking about memories from their wedding day. But Wanjiku wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the glass. Her heart beat so loudly she could barely hear his voice. He didn't notice her discomfort. He was too caught up in the performance, playing the loving husband. Wanjiku reached for her napkin slowly, hands slightly shaking, pretending to adjust her scarf. Her mind flashed with images of her parents, her students, her dreams. No, she couldn't fall for this. She needed to stay calm, act normal. She couldn't let him know she had seen the powder. She had to think, and fast. As Obasi leaned over to light another candle, Wanjiku saw her chance. With a quick but smooth motion, she switched the glasses. It was risky, but she had no choice. Her glass now stood in front of him, his in front of her. He turned back, none the wiser. Obasi lifted his glass again. "To forever," he said warmly. Wanjiku lifted hers, forcing a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "To forever," she echoed, her voice calm. They clinked glasses gently. The sound rang out into the quiet room like a tiny bell of fate. And then, without a second thought, Obasi brought the glass to his lips and took a deep, long sip. He smiled again, pleased with himself. Wanjiku set her glass down slowly. Her fingers trembled under the table, but her face stayed calm. She had done it. Obasi kept talking, but his voice was slowing now. His smile faded. His eyes blinked quickly, as if the room was spinning. He wiped his forehead. Sweat was forming. His hand gripped the edge of the table. "Are you hot?" Wanjiku asked, her voice light. He didn't answer. He was starting to tremble. His breath was short. He clutched his chest. Panic began to rise in his eyes. Wanjiku watched him quietly. She didn't scream. She didn't panic. She just sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap. As he began gasping for air, she stood up and calmly picked up her phone. "Ambulance," she said softly into the receiver. "My husband. Something's wrong. He's collapsing." She gave the address and hung up. Obasi was now on the floor, wheezing, unable to speak. His eyes looked up at her, full of fear and confusion. Wanjiku crouched beside him, her face still calm. "You shouldn't have tried to kill me, Obasi," she whispered. "You thought I wouldn't notice, but I did." The sirens wailed in the distance. Wanjiku stood up again, walked to the door, and opened it gently. Fresh air filled the room. Behind her, the man who tried to poison her lay gasping for breath, his own trap turned against him. She didn't feel hate, only a quiet, heavy sadness. A love story had ended tonight, not with roses, but with powder on a glass and a silent decision to live. Wanjiku felt her heart beating fast as she sat across from Obasi. Her eyes stayed on the glass for a moment longer. That thin white powder on the rim was still there. She had seen it clearly, and now she was sure something was wrong, but she knew she couldn't show fear. If Obasi realized she had noticed, things could turn dangerous very quickly. She had to stay calm. She had to act smart. Obasi was talking non-stop now, laughing too much, smiling too hard. "To us," he said again, raising his glass. "To forever." His voice was louder than usual, almost shaky, but he masked it with fake excitement. He didn't know that Wanjiku was no longer fooled. She kept her face soft, nodding gently, even giving a small smile. Inside, her mind was racing. She needed to think fast. She looked down and began adjusting her scarf. "It's a little tight," she said, touching the cloth near her neck. Obasi didn't pay much attention. He was busy cutting the meat and humming an old love song they used to enjoy. As he leaned over to pour more juice, Wanjiku made her move. In one smooth motion, she slid her glass slightly to the left and pulled his closer to her. It was quick, quiet, and natural. The glasses switched places as if they belonged there all along. She didn't breathe for a second. Did he notice? Did he see anything? She glanced at Obasi. He was still smiling, still proud of himself. He didn't suspect a thing. Wanjiku had pulled off the silent switch without him noticing. She exhaled slowly, her hands now resting on her lap under the table. Obasi picked up the glass, the one he had meant for Wanjiku, and held it up high. "To forever," he said again, his voice louder, more certain. He was celebrating already, thinking his plan was working. Wanjiku picked up the other glass, the safe one, and smiled. "To forever," she repeated, her voice steady. Their glasses touched gently. A soft clink echoed in the quiet room. It was a moment of silence filled with hidden truth. Obasi brought the glass to his lips and drank deeply, emptying half of it in one gulp. Wanjiku watched him closely, her own glass untouched. Her hands didn't shake anymore. The decision had been made. Obasi leaned back, smiling wider. "You see, I still know how to surprise you," he said with a laugh. Wanjiku nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly, "you really do." Her voice was calm, but her eyes were different now, sharp, aware, and full of quiet strength. Minutes passed. Obasi continued to eat, to talk, but then something changed. He paused. A strange look crossed his face. His fingers twitched. He coughed lightly, then again. Sweat began to form on his forehead. His hand went to his chest. Wanjiku sat quietly, watching. She didn't panic. She had already prepared herself for this moment. Obasi's smile started to fade. His eyes blinked fast, like he was trying to clear his vision. He reached for his glass again, but his hand shook. "Are you okay?" Wanjiku asked gently. Her voice was soft, caring, but behind it was a wall of strength. Obasi tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. He began to gasp. Panic filled his face. He pushed back his chair and stood up, but his knees gave in. He collapsed to the floor with a loud thud. Wanjiku stood up slowly, still calm. She looked down at him, breathing heavily on the floor, his mouth moving without sound. She reached for her phone and dialed. "Ambulance," she said quietly. "My husband is having a medical emergency. Please come quickly." She gave them the address. Her voice didn't break. Her hands didn't shake. She walked to the door and opened it, letting the cool night air inside. Behind her, Obasi was still gasping, his plan now turned against him. As she stood by the door, waiting for the ambulance, Wanjiku looked up at the stars. They were quiet and still, like they had watched the whole thing. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling everything, the fear, the betrayal, the pain. But she also felt something else, power. Not the cruel kind Obasi chased, but the kind that comes from staying calm, thinking smart, and protecting yourself. She turned and looked at him one last time. "You said, to forever," she whispered. "But forever doesn't belong to people who plan evil." Her voice didn't tremble. She knew the truth would come out, and she knew she had saved herself, not with shouting or anger, but with a quiet, careful switch, the move that changed everything. The room was still for a moment after they clinked glasses. The soft sound of the toast faded into silence. Obasi leaned back in his chair, looking proud, pleased with himself, thinking his plan had worked. He smiled at Wanjiku, who looked back calmly. She hadn't touched her drink. She didn't need to. She had already switched the glasses. She had already made her choice. Now she just waited. At first nothing seemed wrong. Obasi kept talking, his voice smooth and confident. But then he paused mid-sentence. His hand touched his chest. A strange look came over his face, like something inside him had shifted. He blinked fast, trying to stay steady, but his hands began to shake. His forehead started to sweat. He reached for a napkin and wiped it slowly, pretending it was nothing. Wanjiku didn't move. She sat still, eyes fixed on him. Her face was calm, but inside she was watching every second. She could see it now. The poison was working. Obasi's breath was growing short. He coughed once, then again, louder this time. He tried to clear his throat, but it didn't help. His smile faded completely. His mouth opened slightly as he tried to speak, but only a soft gasp came out. His eyes widened with panic. He stood up quickly, knocking over his chair. His knees wobbled. Wanjiku watched quietly. She didn't rush to help. She didn't cry out. She just sat there, her eyes steady, her body still. Obasi took 2 shaky steps towards the sink, then stopped. His legs gave up. His body hit the floor with a heavy thud. He tried to crawl, his fingers dragging against the tiles, but it was useless. His breathing became loud and uneven, like he was drowning in air. Wanjiku stood up slowly. She walked to her phone on the shelf, picked it up, and dialed the emergency number. "Hello," she said, her voice steady and soft. "I need an ambulance. My husband collapsed. He's not breathing well." She gave the address without rushing, each word clear. She didn't say anything else. She didn't cry or beg for them to come fast. She had no reason to panic. She just needed them to come. Not to save him, that part was already done, but to make sure everything from this moment on was legal, recorded, and real. Obasi lay on the floor, gasping. His eyes were full of confusion and fear. He looked at her, reaching out slightly, but she didn't move closer. She stood there, watching him. She had trusted this man for years. She had shared her home, her heart, her future. And tonight, he had tried to kill her. All for land, for greed. But she had seen through it. Her sharp eyes, her quiet thinking had saved her. He had planned everything, but he had missed one thing. Wanjiku was not weak. She was not blind. And now, he was paying the price for underestimating her. The sound of the ambulance siren echoed in the distance. Wanjiku walked slowly to the door and opened it wide. The cool night air filled the room. The stars outside were bright and silent, like they too had been watching. Behind her, Obasi's breathing slowed. His body stopped moving. Wanjiku didn't turn to look again. She didn't need to. The poison had done what it was meant to do, only not to her. 2 medics rushed in with a stretcher. She stepped aside and let them pass. They bent down, checking for a pulse. One of them looked up at her and asked what had happened. "He collapsed," she said simply. "We were having dinner. He just fell. She didn't give too much detail. Not yet. She would tell the truth, but she wanted everything done properly. There would be questions, investigations, maybe even court. But she was ready. She had nothing to hide. As the medics worked, Wanjiku walked to the kitchen. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small bottle, the one she had found hidden in the garden earlier that week. She had taken it just in case. Now it would be the proof. She placed it gently on the table. It still had Obasi's fingerprints on it. One of the medics looked at her and nodded. They were going to take him to the hospital. She nodded back, silent. She didn't ask if he would be okay. She already knew the answer. She followed them out, not as a scared wife, but as a woman who had seen death coming and outsmarted it. She didn't need revenge. She just needed justice. And now that justice had begun. The hospital room was cold and quiet, filled with the soft beep of machines and the low hum of voices from the hallway. Wanjiku sat in a corner chair, her hands folded on her lap, eyes steady on Obasi's pale face. He lay on the hospital bed, connected to wires and tubes, breathing slow and shallow. The strong, loud man she had once known now looked weak, small, almost like a shadow of himself. Doctors moved in and out of the room, their faces serious, their tones low and focused. After hours of testing and observation, one of them finally walked in holding a medical report. He looked directly at Wanjiku, then down at Obasi. "It was poison," he said quietly. "A strong dose. He's lucky to be alive." Wanjiku nodded slowly, showing no surprise. She had expected this. She had seen the signs from the start, the powder on the glass, the shaking hands, the sweating. Now the truth had a name, and soon it would have consequences. The doctor continued, "We'll need to inform the authorities. This isn't an accident. Someone tried to kill him." Wanjiku's eyes did not blink. Her voice was calm when she replied, "I know." She reached into a handbag and pulled out a small plastic bag. Inside was the poison bottle she had found hidden in the garden just days earlier. She had touched it only with gloves and carefully placed it inside the bag to keep Obasi's fingerprints on it. "This was hidden behind our house," she said. "I found it before our anniversary. I didn't know what it was, but I kept it safe. Something in my heart told me to be careful." The doctor's eyes widened slightly as he took the bag. "We'll give this to the police," he said. "It will help." Not long after, 2 police officers arrived at the hospital. They walked into the room slowly, their steps quiet but firm. Wanjiku stood up to greet them. One officer gently asked her to explain everything she knew. She told them the truth, how her husband had invited her to a surprise dinner, how she had seen the powder on her glass, how she had switched the drinks without him noticing, and how he had collapsed minutes later. She told them about the bottle, about Obasi's growing debt, about how he had become desperate and greedy. Her words were simple, steady, and strong. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just told the story as it happened. A woman who had been marked for death, but refused to let evil win. The officers listened carefully. They asked questions, took notes, and looked closely at the bottle. One of them stepped outside to make a call, and within minutes, more officers arrived. Obasi, still too weak to speak clearly, opened his eyes and saw the police standing at his bedside. For the first time, fear entered his eyes. Real fear, not the fake charm he used at the dinner table. His mouth opened slightly, trying to speak, but no words came out. He looked at Wanjiku, as if hoping for mercy, but she didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked back at him, her eyes calm, her heart steady. The officer stepped forward. "Obasi," he said clearly, "you are under arrest for attempted murder." Obasi blinked hard, his chest rising and falling in panic. But he couldn't run. He couldn't fight. All he could do was lie there as the officer read him his rights and handcuffed him to the hospital bed. One of the nurses turned away quietly, unable to watch. The doctor stood near the doorway, shaking his head slowly. The truth had been uncovered and justice had begun. Wanjiku stepped aside as they secured Obasi's arm to the rail. She didn't feel joy. She didn't smile. It wasn't about revenge. It was about safety. It was about making sure no other woman would be tricked, poisoned, or silenced. As she walked out of the hospital room, the light from the hallway washed over her. She felt the weight on her shoulders begin to lift. For years, she had carried fear, confusion, and silent pain. But now she carried something else: strength, clarity, and truth. People in the waiting area watched her pass. Some had heard whispers of what had happened. Some just saw a quiet woman with tired eyes and a strong walk. No one could guess the storm she had just survived, except those who looked closely. Outside, the sky was turning orange with the evening sun. Wanjiku stood for a moment and breathed in the fresh air. She didn't know what would happen next. Court trials, police reports, long interviews. But she wasn't afraid. She had already faced the darkest part of the story, and she had walked through it alive. Her phone buzzed with a message from her younger sister. "Are you okay?" Wanjiku smiled gently and typed back, "Yes, I'm okay. It's over now." But in her heart, she knew it wasn't just over. It was a beginning, a new life, a second chance, not given, but earned, by watching, thinking, and standing tall when it mattered most. And now, the world would hear her story, not as a victim, but as a woman who saw death and dared to choose life. The hall in Kasumu was full, with women from all walks of life gathered in one room. Some were young and full of dreams. Others were older, carrying years of quiet strength. They came to listen, to learn, and to find hope. The air buzzed with quiet excitement as the next speaker was introduced. Her name was Wanjiku. She walked onto the stage slowly, but with steady steps. She wore a simple dress, her hair tied back, her face calm. She didn't look like someone who had faced death. She looked peaceful, almost gentle. But when she took the microphone and began to speak, her voice carried something powerful. "Truth. Months ago," she began, "I sat at a dinner table with my husband. He smiled at me. He poured me a drink. He told me it was a special night, our anniversary. But what I didn't know was that he had poisoned my glass. He wanted me dead, for land, for money, for greed." There was a soft gasp from the audience, and the room went still. No one moved. Every eye was on her. "I noticed something strange," she continued. "Powder on the rim of the glass. The way he stared at me, not with love, but with fear hiding behind a smile. So I made a choice. While pretending to fix my scarf, I switched the glasses." Murmurs swept across the room. Some women sat back in shock. Others leaned forward, eyes wide. "He drank it himself," Wanjiku said, her voice low and firm. "And when he started to fall, I didn't panic. I called the ambulance, not to save him, but to make sure everything was recorded. I had already found the poison bottle hidden in the garden. I gave it to the police. His fingerprints were still on it." She paused for a moment, letting the silence speak. Then she continued, softer now. "I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because I wanted to live, because I refused to be another woman buried in silence. I wanted to be heard. I wanted to be free." The hall remained still. Some women wiped tears from their eyes. Others nodded slowly, deeply moved. "I'm not here to make anyone afraid," she said. "I'm here to remind you that your voice matters, your mind matters, your life matters. No one has the right to take it from you. Not a husband, not a family member, not anyone." She looked around the room, her gaze strong. "Sometimes we are told to keep quiet, to stay small, to forgive and forget, even when it hurts. But I want to tell you this. It is not weakness to speak the truth. It is not disrespect to protect your life." Someone in the crowd stood and clapped, then another and another. Soon, the entire hall was on its feet, clapping loudly, many with tears in their eyes. Wanjiku smiled gently, holding the mic close. "I was once afraid too, but fear didn't save me. My eyes did, my thoughts did, my courage did, and yours can too." The applause lasted long after she stepped off the stage. Her story spread fast. Someone had recorded the entire speech on their phone. Within hours, clips of her words were being shared all over social media. People from all parts of Kenya, and even other countries, watched and listened. Some called her the woman who outsmarted death. Others called her a hero in silence. Her calm strength, her soft but firm voice, touched hearts across the world. Women sent her messages of support. Men, too, shared their respect, shocked at the truth she had lived through. Activists quoted her words. News stations asked to interview her. Her story was no longer just hers. It had become a voice for many others who were still afraid to speak. Back in her small rural home in Nigerian, life became quiet again. But Wanjiku was no longer the same woman who had once walked through fear. She now worked with women's groups, helping others find their voice. She helped teach girls in school about boundaries, safety, and courage. She worked with the police to support survivors of domestic violence. She didn't just survive. She chose to make her survival mean something. On weekends, she would sit by her window, sipping tea, watching the trees sway gently in the wind. She often thought of that night, the dinner, the toast, the poison, but she didn't feel broken. She felt whole. What Obasi meant for harm had become the fire that lit a new path. And though he now sat behind bars, Wanjiku walked free, not just in her body, but in her mind, her spirit, and her purpose. She didn't carry bitterness, she carried lessons. She didn't live in anger, she lived in truth. And that truth, spoken in simple words on a stage in Kisumu, had changed lives. As more people watched her speech, one message kept echoing online. Under every video, every photo, every comment, she didn't just survive, she rose. Obasi sat on the cold, hard bench in the small prison room, his hands cuffed and his face thin and tired. His eyes had lost their old shine, the pride, the arrogance, the control, all gone. He now looked like a man who had been eaten from the inside by regret and silence. Around him, the other prisoners chatted or stared at the wall, but Obasi's eyes were fixed on the small TV mounted high on the wall. A news program was playing. The camera showed a big event in Nairobi, bright lights flashing, people clapping. Then her face appeared, Wanjiku. She stood on a stage, holding a glass award in her hands, smiling gently. Her voice came through the speakers, strong and calm, just like he remembered. The news reporter spoke with excitement, saying, "Wanjiku, the brave teacher from Nigerian, is being honoured today as a community justice icon." Obasi's jaw tightened. He didn't blink. He didn't move. The woman he had tried to destroy was now being celebrated. She wasn't just alive. She was rising, free, respected, powerful. As the screen faded to black, a voiceover echoed through the room. She didn't just survive. She taught betrayal its own bitter lesson. And Obasi, broken and alone, had no choice but to watch.